Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast, Joseph Smith edition. I am your host, John Dehlin. It is October 2nd, 2025, and today is episode 17 in our series of the Joseph Smith Podcast, where, for starters, we are reviewing the life of Joseph Smith in detail, following along in what I'll say the Mormon Stories best-selling book, Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet, by Professor John G. Turner of George Mason University. Again, if you're joining us for the first time, we are going pretty much chronologically, having a never LDS, super reputable, credible, good-natured, and thoughtful and enjoyable historian call balls and strikes and basically just help us learn the story of the founder of the Mormon faith, my faith of origin, and of my family and friends, chronologically from the beginning. We're about halfway done with the book. I do recommend you start from the beginning. You can consume these episodes in the Mormon Stories YouTube feed. We have a playlist of the Joseph Smith podcast available on our YouTube channel, on the Mormon Stories YouTube channel. You can also find us on Spotify under the Mormon Stories podcast channel, or we've even created a Joseph Smith podcast channel on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you want to consume them without the clutter of the other Mormon Stories episodes. But we're loving this series. We're grateful to all the Mormon Stories donors that make the Mormon Stories podcast possible, and specifically to the donors to the Joseph Smith podcast project with John Turner that have helped to fund this series. So thank you to everyone who's made this possible. And today we're going to be covering chapter 16, or at least most of chapter 16. Chapter 16 is entitled Abraham, 1835. So we're going to be covering part of the year 1835 in the Kirtland era, specifically talking about the origins and some of the early writings of Joseph Smith that lead to what Mormons know as the Book of Abraham, which is canonized scripture. So for those who don't know, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints considers the Old and New Testament of the Holy Bible as scripture. Mormons, we consider ourselves to be Christian, but also we have the Book of Mormon, which you're probably aware of, and the Doctrine and Covenants. And then there's additional scripture called what we call inside the church the Pearl of Great Price, which includes two books that come to my mind, the Book of Moses and the Book of Abraham, both of which are reported to be translations from Joseph Smith, the prophet. So today we're going to be talking about the background and some of her early history of the Book of Abraham. And we're going to be talking about mummies and scrolls and Egyptomania. And we've covered this quite extensively before on Mormon Stories podcast. I do want to refer everyone to the very lengthy, probably 13-hour series we did with Robert Rittner, the late famous Chicago Egyptologist that talked to us a lot about the Book of Abraham. It's definitely one of the top 5 things I've ever done on Mormon Stories. Check out the Robert Rittner series. It's very technical, but very good. We've also had others like Dan Vogel and Brett Metcalf and LDS Discussions and John Hamer and others all talk about the Book of Abraham previously as well. So lots of Mormon Stories coverage on the Book of Abraham, but we've never had the John Turner on to discuss the Book of Abraham. So without any further ado, I bring back to the podcast Professor John G. Turner. Hey, John G. Turner.
Hi, John Dehlin. What's your middle name?
Parkinson. John P.
John P. Dehlin. I mean, you need to sound more like a general authority. You got to use the middle initial.
I'll work on that.
Okay.
Okay. Before we jump into today's episode, we both agreed that it would be worth addressing some of the recent current events in September and October of 2025. We haven't really talked about it on Mormon Stories, but I think it makes sense to address it. The second episode of a two-part series we did on Scientology. Last week we released a two-part series. John G. Turner, you may not know this, but last last week we released a 2-part series with some ex-Scientologists talking about their escape from Scientology. And during the first recording of that 2-part series, the Charlie Kirk murder happened while we were recording. And then, so for the second episode of that series, which we recorded the next day, I basically just made the statement that, condolences to the families and friends and supporters of Charlie Kirk, how horrific we all feel about that terrible tragedy, how much we condemn violence of any kind. And so that's the extent to which Charlie Kirk has been discussed on Mormon Stories podcast. We've intentionally chosen not to get political, not to delve into that. And if that weren't horrific enough, then last Sunday, just a few days ago, the terrible Michigan, we'll call them murders, happened in a Mormon chapel in Michigan that just adds to this violent, horrific sort of month that is that involves Mormonism. And of course, given that you and I have been discussing anti-Mormonism and violence, we recently talked about Zion's Camp and all the Missouri adversity against Latter-day Saints and Joseph Smith. It's not just horrific and sobering, but it's quite timely given all that we've been reviewing. So maybe I would love to hear any thoughts you want to share as it relates to violence, these tragedies, Mormonism, or just your sense of history or whatever.
Sure. No, I thought I was very sad to read and watch some of the coverage of the murders this past Sunday. I think there's always sort of a tension between wanting to draw larger lessons from a horrific act and also recognizing that it's a unwell, deranged, hateful, whatever combination of that individual did something terrible, that that's the main thing, and caused a tremendous amount of suffering. I do think I do think a little bit about the history of anti-Mormon violence. And there are all sorts of anti-X violence topics in U.S. history. I think anti-Mormon violence in terms of the 19th century, it's not something. It's something that is deeply resonant with Latter-day Saints. It's not something that resonates with non-Mormons. I for instance, just today I was telling my students about the 1838 executive order demanding that the Mormons leave the state of Missouri or face extermination. Their jaws just drop that a governor of an American state could issue an order like that. Something like the Hans Mill massacre, I will just say they don't make Netflix series about that. Mormons doing violent things, and Mormons sometimes did. That's always made for good TV, good novels. Anti-Mormon violence, that is harder for other Americans to wrap their heads around. I think that's just a reality. I don't think that necessarily pertains to what happened this past weekend in any close way, but when the subject of anti-Mormon violence comes up, that's what I tend to think. I've got one other thought, but I'll pause and invite you to tell me what's on your mind.
No, I mean, go ahead and share your other thought, and then I'll maybe ask a question or two.
Sure. The other thought I've had in the last couple of weeks is, religion tends to make the news when religious people do something bad, or when something bad happens to a group of religious people. And it's never heartwarming, right? It's often it's these terrible acts. I will say in the last couple of weeks, two things that have really stuck with me are, number one, Erica Kirk's public forgiveness of her husband's murderer at his memorial, and her quoting scripture from the New Testament, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And then also just the fundraising effort that a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints established for the family of the Michigan shooter. I probably most listeners have heard about this. There's a Latter-day Saint in Provo, Utah, named David Butler. He's an author, fiction writer, and he noted that this man has now left behind a widow and children who have a lot of financial need and who are traumatized. And that effort at this point has raised nearly $300,000. And it's just so touching to read the comments, mostly from Latter-day Saints, about why they feel motivated to give money to help the family of someone who just traumatized their community. I find that just deeply moving, and I love it when people, draw on just the really good parts of their religious tradition to support communities in times of need, and sometimes just to do extraordinary acts of charity. I love that.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Well, here's something that I would really love to get your take on, not to have you switch from the role of historian to therapist, but I would be lying if I didn't. Well, first of all, like, one of the worst impulses we all have, I think, that you kind of addressed, touched on, is everyone's attempt to say what was behind, what was the cause of the murder of Charlie Kirk? Who can we blame? In the words of John Steinbeck, who do we shoot, right? Like, who do we blame for inspiring and motivating Charlie Kirk's killer? And then who do we blame for inspiring the Michigan murder? And of course, it's been really troubling for me to have some people, especially in our community, say, well, it's clearly, Mormon podcasters and or ex-Mormon podcasters or influencers who criticize or even give voice to criticisms of the church, or scrutinize Joseph Smith, or express concerns about social justice or safety within an LDS context. It's those people that are inciting the violence. And then, of course, others want to put it on evangelical Christians. And, on the one hand, I just want to say it's caused me to really pause and want to do deep introspection. I always want to believe my work comes from a love for the Mormon people. My work comes from a love of my Mormon heritage, from a love of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for a desire for my people to heal and grow, for the church to become better and to help more people. Like, I always hope that people see the work that I do with that spirit, even when it gets emotional or critical. And at the same time, I always also want to ask, am I part of the problem? Am I contributing to an unproductive climate of contention, And so, even to the point where I ask you, should we even continue this series? Because, like, in a time when Mormons are being attacked or Mormons are scrutinized, is it even just inappropriate to be looking at the life of the church's founder, and or even discussing both good things and bad things about the church's founder given that the temperature is so hot right now. So, I mean, I know that's a lot to put at even your feet, and I'm not asking you to solve any big problems or even give any big answers, but I would, as an outsider, as someone who probably can see this a little more objectively, I would love to hear any thoughts or counsel you have, even big picture,
Yeah, I don't know that I don't really have any words of wisdom or unusual insight, John. Those are just tough questions. I do think there's a tendency when there are heinous crimes, right? We want to blame someone other than the perpetrator. We want to blame a, one political half of the country or the rhetoric that certain groups of people use. And there's certainly reasonable examination of rhetoric and the cultural backdrop of things. I do think, for the most part, that tendency in response to heinous crimes is a little bit off the mark usually. In that in these instances, the people who are responsible for them are the people who did them. I have strong feelings about what the way that many of my evangelical brethren have talked about um, Mormons, uh, especially the time that I've been cognizant about it, which is maybe the last several decades. I definitely think, my own opinion is that Latter-day Saints are Christians and that evangelicals should approach them as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, regardless, honestly, of what the LDS church might teach about other churches. And I will say that rhetoric has improved, I think, quite a lot in recent decades. So, I think, yeah, all of us should be bridge builders and peace builders. I think it's great. There's a growing tradition within the church. People like Patrick Mason and Chad Ford speaking about peace building as a Latter-day Saint tradition and theological doctrine, and I see that bubbling up a little bit too within the church. I think it's a great thing. It's hard to do, but the examples I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think those are people doing that, whether or not they're articulating it that way. There are plenty of people who at this particular time are looking for ways to build bridges, turn the temperature down, and that those are good things. So I don't have a way of resolving the dilemmas you introduced. I guess one other thing I would say is I try to sell my students on this in the classroom, that to critically examine a tradition or a movement or a thinker is not hateful. It can be done in a hateful way, but in a way, it's also a mark of respect. And, I teach classes in which um, we analyze Judaism, Christianity, and Islam um, alongside each other. And it would be disrespectful, for instance, not to take the same approach to the Quran as one might take to the Bible. I think the critical examination of traditions, it can be done respectfully, and in a way, it is a measure of respect to say, "Look, I take this seriously enough to take a scholarly look at it."
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And I guess I just want to say, uh, this series, I hope that those who have been paying attention to the series on Joseph Smith will find I think I would say, John Turner, our mutual love and respect. for the tradition of Mormonism and the history of Mormonism, and even for the prophet Joseph Smith in this work. And I hope that people have found it to be fair and respectful. And I also just want to say I want to really do as much soul searching as I can to make sure that anything I or we do going forward just only takes more seriously the importance of being respectful and thoughtful and fair in our coverage of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints founder, Joseph Smith.
I'm good with that, which doesn't mean that, at least for me, that when Joseph Smith does something kind of zany, not going to be able to, it's not that I wouldn't point that out or even chuckle at that. But I do take him seriously. And I think he was a serious thinker and innovator. And we will continue to point to Joseph at his best and Joseph at his worst. And I think help listeners to make sense of both of those things together.
He called himself a rough stone rolling, after all.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that, John Turner. I know so many of my listeners and viewers just really value your insight and wisdom and perspective. So thank you.
You got it.
All right. Well, today is all about the Book of Abraham. And I should give also the disclaimer that it's actually about part one of your treatment of the Book of Abraham in this book, because as those of us who have tried to understand this issue and topic before, there's a good deal of Book of Abraham activity in Kirtland in the 1835 space, and then it just kind of like pauses, and then it picks up in the Nauvoo time period. So this is not the end of our discussion of the Book of Abraham. It's only the beginning. But what I thought might be an okay place to start would be, John Turner, for you to kind of set the stage for what I think I learned to call Egyptomania, but it may have other terms. Can you give us some of the historical context for Egyptomania that exists prior to Michael Chandler's appearance in Kirtland in 1835?
Absolutely. I'm also, before I plunge into that, I'm going to say there is so much really good, thoughtful scholarship on the Book of Abraham in recent years. And I also listened to and appreciated the 4-part series. I think it was 4 parts that you did with Robert Rittner. And, I will also, I brought some show and tell today, the Joseph Smith Papers volume on the Book of Abraham. I lugged that in to the office today.
Light reading, little light reading.
It's not the heaviest Joseph Smith Papers volume, but it's pretty heavy. And, they cite everybody from John Gee to Robert Rittner. And I also, because I find it a very useful, concise guide, I brought in Dan Vogel's recent Book of Abraham apologetics, which is really useful on the chronology. I also am a big admirer of Sam Brown's work on the Book of Abraham. And there's a subset of scholars who are so dedicated that they really get into the minutia of the glyphs in the Book of Abraham and putting all of the documents together and understanding the relationship among them. I'm going to just preface this by saying I'm not quite that granular on the Book of Abraham. I'm also obviously not an Egyptologist. My main interest is trying to figure out, what does this tell us about Joseph Smith? So for me, the driving question is the Book of Abraham a translation of an ancient record? But it's, what prompts Joseph's interest in this material? How does he engage with it? How does he understand what he's doing? And I think there's some questions that are actually hard to answer, or that we can't fully answer. So, Egyptomania. So a lot of this is prompted by the I would say European escapades in Egypt. So Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, and in subsequent
Is that when he blew the nose off the Sphinx? Is that?
I think I've heard that.
Yeah.
And in subsequent years, both the French and the British essentially looted um, a large number of ancient Egyptian tombs and brought many artifacts back to places like London. And also, individuals would acquire mummies and papyri and, cart them around, even around the United States of Joseph Smith's day. So there's simply a much, there's just a volume of exploration, exploitation, commercialization. And um, there are also some advances in terms of understanding Egyptian hieroglyphics. The Napoleon's troops discovered what became known as the Rosetta Stone. A French Egyptologist was able to use that, I think, beginning around 1820, able to begin decoding hieroglyphics. But that was that was just at the starting point. And so pretty much nobody could read ancient Egyptian as of 1835. So there's not only you have this proliferation of Egyptian artifacts and writings, but they're super mysterious in that people can't read them. And so it creates a situation of cultural fascination without cultural understanding.
So that you hear about this guy, is it Champollion? How do you pronounce it?
Champollion.
Champollion. That's who you're referring to, right?
Correct.
And yeah, so like for a long time, I thought when Joseph produced the Book of Abraham that maybe the Rosetta Stone hadn't been deciphered yet. But then I learned that Champollion, or however you pronounce it, he did at least partially. So yeah, if you can't clear that up for me, he did or did not decode the Rosetta Stone.
He did
10 years prior.
I think it was sometime in the early 1820s.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that suddenly there were plenty of Egyptologists who could read hieroglyphics. In fact, I think it's safe to say nobody in the Western Hemisphere could have made any headway with the writings that Joseph Smith acquired in 1835.
And again, it's Champollion.
I say Champollion.
Champollion.
I can do German. I can't do French. So,
So is it fair to say also that maybe people in North America didn't know that Champollion had deciphered to some extent the Rosetta Stone or even discovered it?
So I believe that had been publicized by this point, but it's
the discovery of the Rosetta Stone or the possible deciphering of the Rosetta Stone?
I think both the discovery and the initial decoding.
Okay.
But what I would say is this was it was still at the early stages. So I don't know enough about it to talk about it in more detail, John, but I don't think anyone could have made quick work of any Egyptian writing at this time. But Champollion and perhaps some others were beginning to make some headway during these years.
Okay. And part of that is thinking about, I mean, again, we're going to be talking about the extent to which Joseph Smith really felt like he was actually doing real translation, either spiritual or mechanical. But for those who would want to be suspicious about Joseph's motives, they would want to understand if he felt like there was an imminent threat that his translation could be disproven at the time he might be producing it. And that's why for some that question might come into play. Like if Joseph's thinking, I certainly don't want to pretend to translate something that someone else can disprove, at least while I'm living, or even with my legacy. Now, what he did afterwards, I think, questions that whole type of question. But still, do you know kind of what I'm asking about?
Yeah, I don't think it was an active concern for Joseph as of 1835 or
Being
even.
disproven
I don't
or
think so.
okay.
Yeah.
That says something, right?
Yeah.
What does that, I mean, what does that say? What would that say to you? I know I'm being weird in how I'm asking the question. Not intentionally,
Yeah,
but
no, I mean, I would say if Joseph had acquired the papyri in 1900, it would have been a different situation. But I think in 1835, he doesn't feel that somebody's going to fact check him.
right. Yeah. Okay. All right. I drove through like Tennessee and Memphis wondering why there's a pyramid there. Like talk about how Egyptomania kind of, you mentioned Thomas Jefferson, like give it, if you don't mind, share some of the examples you share in the book of manifestations of how Egyptomania kind of sweeps the country.
Yeah. So even before this, this goes way back. I mean, this goes back to ancient Judaism, early Christianity. There's this just a strong sense that Egypt represents knowledge, maybe secret knowledge, wisdom, beauty. And Europeans have gone to Egypt in search of that long before Napoleon blasted his way in the late 1700s. But I think it's just it's a accelerated interest in the early 1800s, and so like you said, you have as Americans move west across North America, they'll name places Memphis, Alexandria. Um, and it was actually I had never thought about it, but the adoption of the obelisk as a popular monument,
Like the
that
Washington Monuments and Obelisk, right?
right, Washington, Joseph Smith birthplace in
Right.
South Royalton, Vermont, and then also um, there's popular interest in mummies in particular. And that hadn't quite occurred, that hadn't quite clicked with me. If you go to, say, the British Museum in London, I think you can see mummies. You can see mummies various places, and they're kind of cool, but or creepy depending on your perspective. It's October, but that you have people displaying mummies in communities across the country uh, in 1835, and people turn out in droves to see them, and they'll pay 25 cents a pop, and so there's some money to be made in acquiring Egyptian artifacts and displaying them and attracting paying crowds.
Okay. And I'm gonna come back to that and ask whether Joseph saw dollar signs possibly when Chandler rolls into Kirtland. Um so yeah, all right. So yeah, let's talk about Chandler rolling into Kirtland then. who is Michael Chandler and how does he end up in Kirtland?
So Chandler, a few people have poked around into his background. He's not a well-known individual. He was born in Ireland, immigrated to the United States in the late 1820s. He at some point became either in charge or acquired a set of 11 mummies, and he carted them around the United States to different cities, took them to Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, New Orleans, and sold some of them along the way. And then by the time he got to Cleveland, he had 4 remaining mummies, 2 papyrus scrolls, and some additional sort of smaller pieces of papyrus. And so he's kind of getting near the end of his tour. He's made his circuit, and he wanted to sell his remaining wares. And so he got wind that Joseph Smith possessed the power to translate characters, ancient characters. And I think Chandler sensed, he might have a potential buyer for what he had left. And so he rolled into Kirtland, set up his collection at a hotel, and sort of waited for Joseph to come round, I think.
I'll ask you a question you might not be able to possibly answer, but yeah, when you mentioned that Chandler's awareness of Joseph Smith's claim to be able to translate Egyptian might have been a possible motive for him showing up in Kirtland, or maybe certainly was. Does that imply, A, that he believed that it might be possible Joseph actually could translate Egyptian, B, that he saw him as a mark of like someone who just would be a potential buyer because he alleged to have that power, someone he could fool, or some other possible speculation or derivation of that
Yeah,
question.
this is speculative because we don't have much information on Chandler, but I would speculate strongly that he thought Joseph Smith would be a mark. I mean, he wouldn't have gone to Kirtland otherwise. And I would suspect that he wouldn't have thought that Joseph actually could translate um, his papyrus documents, but that Joseph might have wanted to buy them.
And then he would offer a good price
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah, no, because the price was steep. He sold them for $2,400. My sense is there wasn't really a negotiation. Joseph found 2 individuals to split the price with him. Joseph Coe was one. I forget who the third person was, but Joseph leapt at the opportunity. And it's actually kind of outrageous because that's a lot of money in 1835. And Joseph and the church are accruing a lot of debt with the construction of the Kirtland Temple. And I don't know how Joseph fronted the $800 that he was responsible for, but it's a lot of money. And I think at the same time, Joseph just leapt at it.
We don't have any way of adjusting for inflation, estimating how much that would be in today's dollars, do we?
I mean, we could find a calculator online.
Yeah.
I'm not going to guess, but it's a really handsome, handsome price.
Okay. Yeah. So really quickly, you talked about all the different ways Egypt meant things to people in the day. Talk spiritually. Did Egypt have any sort of spiritual significance to people in the day?
So Egypt did have long-standing spiritual significance to Jews and Christians. So the Old Testament narratives of Abraham and Joseph intersect with Egypt. According to the Bible, both Abraham and Joseph spent time in Egypt. There is, stretching way back, Jewish and then Christian speculation of the intersection between ancient Judaism and Egypt. The first century Jewish historian Josephus believed that Abraham had brought the sciences of mathematics and astronomy to the Egyptians, who then passed them along to the Greeks. So people for many centuries had seen Egypt as sort of a conduit for ancient learning. There are all sorts of sort of more esoteric traditions about Egypt as a source for knowledge and spiritual power as well.
Yeah, you mentioned that some people, when I don't know, viewing or contemplating Egyptian artifacts, would become absorbed in meditation and awe.
Yeah. I think that was simply more like it's amazing to gaze on something that in some way still looks human from 2000 or 2500 or 1800 years ago. So I think for a lot of Americans who gazed upon mummies for the first time, it was in some way a spiritual, mystical experience that filled them with awe and wonder.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So, really quickly, one of the questions that I asked Robert Rittner a long time ago was, it wasn't until relatively recently, past 10 years or so, that I realized that it's probably an open question as to whether or not a, a historical figure named Abraham actually ever existed. And I think a superficial reading of the Bible would just go, well, clearly Abraham existed because the Old Testament writes about him. It's Adam and then Cain and Abel and Noah and then Abraham. So Abraham must have existed, right? But that's not an open and shut case, correct?
So, no, not as far as biblical scholars are concerned. So, there's a couple ways to frame this. So, I would say scholars of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament tend to divide. This is really rudimentary. I'm not a biblical scholar. Sort of tend to divide into two camps on these sorts of questions. So there are minimalists will sort of presume that biblical narratives are ahistorical without corroborating evidence from outside the Bible, say archaeology, and then maximalists who are going to presume that biblical narratives are historical unless there's outside evidence that contradicts them. So, for really ancient figures like Abraham and Moses, there's no outside corroboration. I'd say it's a different sort of discussion than one gets about the historical Jesus, for whom at least we have some first century extra biblical sources that can lead us to conclude that, yeah, a man named Jesus existed. Might not be able to get too much farther than that. But for figures like Abraham and Moses, we just don't have anything other than the biblical accounts. And so I think whether or not people presume in the existence of a historical Abraham or Jacob or Joseph or Moses, I think that simply hinges on whether or not they are reading the Bible as history or myth.
Yeah, and there are even practicing Jews who don't believe that Moses, the technical founder of their religious tradition, even existed. Correct?
That is true.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
sort of depends on the branch of Judaism. For Orthodox Jews, it's absolutely historical. For Reform Jews, yeah, just maybe it doesn't matter too much even.
Yeah. So when Josephus claims that maybe Abraham brought certain versions of science or mathematics to the Egyptians, he's just speculating or faith-based scholarship?
I mean, those are probably rooted in legends that go farther back, extra biblical legends. I mean, the book of Genesis certainly places Abraham as having sojourned in Egypt, but we don't really have anything else to go on.
Okay. All right. So there's a little bit of interesting, I don't know, authentication that happens between Chandler and Joseph Smith.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of maybe ego stroking. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So when Joseph and Oliver Cowdery get word that Chandler has brought his Egyptian mummies and papyrus documents into town, they visit him. I think, at least within a day, maybe the same day. And the prophet engaged in some translation on the spot. And
which is very Zelf-like, you know what I'm saying? Just like free
right.
association translation.
Right. And Chandler, I think, he signs a certificate that pronounces that Joseph's interpretation is in accord with the opinions of, these are the words on the certificate, the most learned. Now, this is all just fanciful, because Chandler had no way of knowing what was, what the hieroglyphics meant. And in fact, nobody in the whole hemisphere really could have said anything of, much use. But, Chandler, I think he's flattering Joseph by saying, yeah, you're really on the right track here. And, maybe that helps facilitate the sale.
The transaction.
Yeah.
I loved in the middle of page 161 of your book, you talk about how Chandler and the mummies intersected in the scrolls, intersected with Joseph's interests. Can you tell us about, again, this is kind of obvious, but tell us why Joseph was immediately willing to drop several $1,000s, based on his interests and passions.
So Joseph, I write that he loved graves and their relics. That's actually not super unusual. A lot of Americans did, but I see that running through the treasure hunts that preceded the Book of Mormon. See that as, inherent to the Book of Mormon plates. Also the excavation of Zelf, Joseph and his associates on science camp, they dig into a grave, they find some bones. Joseph also has a pre-existing interest, if you will, in Egypt, because the Book of Mormon asserts, and I think this is congruent with these ancient ideas about the intersection of Jewish and Egyptian knowledge and language. Book of Mormon asserts that Lehi's record consists of the learning of the Jews in the language of the Egyptians. Moroni identifies the characters with which he writes as Reformed Egyptian. So Joseph, there are reasons why this tracks with his interests and passions.
Yeah, and it would make just total sense. Oh, dang, as I'm thinking about it, it's almost a sign of Joseph Smith's sincerity that when he sees papyri and mummies and he's asked to translate papyri, immediately he says, well, it's got to be related to Abraham and Moses somehow, because Old Testament, you know what I mean? Like,
right.
He knew the Old Testament so well, that's going to be what comes to his mind. And that's immediately the association he's going to make with anything Egyptian.
Yeah. So very quickly, he identifies the scrolls, which, they're, as far as I know, they're sort of laid in the arms of the mummies in various states of preservation and decay. He identifies them as the sacred record kept of Joseph in Pharaoh's court and the teachings of Father Abraham. So the two sort of ancient patriarchs who spend time in Egypt.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a bold leap, especially if you don't know how to read Egyptian. It's a bold leap to assert that that's what the texts are about. Is that fair to say?
That is a very bold leap indeed. But if you were going to think about what would be the greatest ancient texts you could find if you are interested in this intersection of Old Testament, ancient Judaism and Egypt, it would be Joseph and Abraham.
Yeah. Yeah. And clearly Joseph he kind of loved the Old Testament, right?
He did. He loved the book of Genesis, spends a lot of time ruminating on it. And yeah, well, of course, the way that what he ultimately unfolds in the book of Abraham intersects with the book of Genesis.
Yeah. Okay. So he buys the scrolls and the papyrus. Remind us, we talked about this in previous episodes, but remind us why Joseph and some of his colleagues cared so much about languages and what it had to do with their spirituality and their cosmology and their theology.
So, huge subject. So Joseph, he cares about, he does take an interest in ancient languages. As we'll see later in this chapter, he takes a pretty avid interest in learning Hebrew, dabbles a little bit with Greek, the New Testament Greek. Joseph is also interested in what I would say is a more mystical quest to recover what he understands as the pure or heavenly language that the earliest humans, according to the biblical account, that they would have used in their conversations with God. And this is not original to Joseph Smith. Quite a number of other Christians believe that Hebrew was that original pure heavenly language. Joseph's thought goes in a little bit of a different direction. He believes that he can recover the pure language spoken by Adam, at least in part by revelation. So I don't think we talked about this on a previous episode, but back in 1832, Joseph had dictated what his scribe labeled a sample of pure language. It's short. It's just a sample. So words for God, words for Jesus Christ, words,
Amen, right?
Amen, Amen.
Yeah.
Words for human being. And this is clearly still an active concern for Joseph in 1835, because one of Joseph's close associates during this time is William Phelps. He sends his wife a specimen of some of the pure language. That's the way he describes it. And he includes some hieroglyphic characters. So he by this point, some characters have been added to the sample that Joseph had produced several years earlier.
For Martin Harris, right? For Martin Harris, and
I forget who served as his scribe
at that point.
in March of 1832. I would say for Joseph and for Phelps and for other people who took an interest, this was not just an arcane scholarly matter, but possessing these pure language words, there's a belief in their spiritual potency that knowing them, having access to them, could unlock spiritual power.
Weirdly, it speaks again, possibly for me, to Joseph's sincerity. Like, I mentioned this, the Scientologist that I interviewed last week or the week before, they believe that by the time L. Ron Hubbard dies, he believes in what he's teaching Scientologists about all the theology and quote doctrine and you know, that I've heard some apologists say if Joseph Smith wanted to have sex, there were a lot of easier ways for him to do it than become a polygamist and try and institutionalize it religiously. And if Joseph were just wanting to be a fraud, there would be a lot of other ways he could make money or deceive people than spend a ton of time translating languages or faking the attempt to translate languages. Like, there's a lot of other ways he could have made a lot of money quickly, potentially. In other words, this very act, beginning before the scrolls ever arrive in Kirtland, of trying to determine the pure language, to you, does that speak to Joseph's sincerity a little bit?
So it's a great question, and in a way, for us, this is a central question this week because, again, I'm going to put some words into your mouth, John. You don't think that Joseph's Book of Abraham, you don't think it's a translation of the ancient.
Where you're going. I see where you're going here.
I don't think you think that's the translation of the ancient writings of Abraham, and neither do I.
Let's just say I've never found a non-BYU scholar who thought they were.
I don't think that's not a live scholarly question outside the confines of the church.
Yeah.
But then we're left with these other questions like, well, what is, is Joseph sincere? Does he actually think he can translate these ancient documents? Does he think he can recover by revelation the pure language of all sorts of things? So what I write later in the chapter is the Egyptian project wasn't a straightforward act of deception, right? Joseph, he's engaged, right? He creates these alphabets, this grammar. He could have just dictated in the Book of Abraham, the 1835 and 1842 portions collectively, that's 5 chapters. That's nothing for the translator of the Book of Mormon, right? But he doesn't do that. And so to what extent was he sincere? So here's some initial thoughts. I think he wanted to be able to translate ancient Egyptian writings. He wanted to be able to master Hebrew and Greek. And I think he wasn't quite sure whether to try to proceed in a scholarly or revelatory sense. And I think that's
those are two things: scholarly, option A, or B, revelatory. I just want to make sure those weren't together. That phrase, you were outlining 2 options, correct?
Right. I mean, I think he is, he gets a little tired of everybody doubting him, right? And criticizing the Book of Mormon. I think he wants to demonstrate his bona fides, his bona fides as a translator, and
his translator chops.
And at the same time, I think this is really frustrating. So, he dictates a few sentences, then he takes a break. He works on the alphabet and the grammar. He dictates some more, takes another break, dictates some more. And this is just several months in 1835, and then he stops after what's now the 18th verse of the 2nd chapter of the Book of Abraham. So I think he's frustrated, and then he stops there and he launches into the study of Hebrew, which he actually can study. He's not a savant when it comes to Hebrew, but he can make some headway. I think he believes that learning Hebrew will help him with the Egyptian because, like a lot of people, he believes the 2 languages are connected. There are some, there are some loose connections between Egypt and Semitic languages, but it's not really going to help him with the hieroglyphics. And so I think I see a Joseph who is, on some level, knows he can't translate these texts, tries academically, or even on the, I think he was also frustrated with his revelatory efforts, which is why he makes a relatively little headway in 1835 and works in such fits and starts, and then sets the project aside for 7 years.
Is that what? And I don't expect you to have command of what informed that position, but what makes you think he was possibly other than the pause, what makes you think he was doubting his ability to channel the meaning of the Book of Abraham from a revelatory perspective? Because that's the church's position today, that it wasn't a translation, it's that the papyrus catalyzed, this is the catalyst theory, catalyzed his revealing through revelation, not translation, the text. What makes you think he was doubting even his revelatory powers, other than the pause?
Well, I think for me, it's the fits and starts nature of it.
Okay.
So, he starts by translating what we have as the first 3 verses of Abraham 1. Then there's this effort with the alphabet. I think in October of 1835, so several months later, he resumes translation, eventually gets to what's now the 18th verse of Abraham 2. So I think, the fits and starts. I think that's not to say that Joseph doesn't in some way believe in what he's dictating. I mean, I think to some extent, John, that's an unanswerable question. Now, I think the ideas that are included in the Book of Abraham and the other Egyptian materials, things like an expanding universe, other inhabitable worlds, solar systems rotating around the throne of God. I don't see any reason to doubt that Joseph wasn't attracted to those ideas. I think that makes sense, that some people by lineage cannot hold the priesthood. That's another idea that's expressed, I think, in chapter 1 of the Book of Abraham. I think, I presume Joseph believed that, but he doesn't really flesh that out in terms of its ramifications. So I see a Joseph who, for 5 months or so, he's playing around with all of these ideas. I think at times it's fun. It's fun to buy 4 mummies and some scrolls, and it's fun to look at the pictures in the vignettes and on some of the scrolls. And
Facsimiles.
it's fun to play around with the glyphs and think about their possible meaning, but it's also frustrating.
Yeah. Really, really quickly, before we talk about some of the text that he actually produces, let's just cut to the chase. What do we know now, the mummies, and who were the mummies, and what were on the scrolls as far as we know now, based on Egyptian scholars? Whatever summary you want to make of that, just so we establish what it was before we then talk about how Joseph interpreted what he was seeing.
So, I'll give just a really brief overview. People wanting to know more, they can look in the Joseph Smith Papers volume. They could look in the edition that Robert Rittner published. Those are great sources of more detail. And keep in mind, these scrolls, as we have them, these are now in fragments, so we don't have them as scrolls. But several of the fragments that we do have, they come from what Egyptologists refer to as a book of breathing for a priest in Thebes named Hor, who probably lived in the early 2nd century before the Christian era.
which, which,
And
which doesn't match up with the date of when Abraham would have existed, correct?
correct, off by, I don't know, a couple millennia, many centuries.
Yeah.
So what's a book of breathing? That would be a good follow-up question. So it's essentially a text that contains spells, if you will, that would enable a deceased individual to secure resurrection and eternal life. So this is something you'd want to be buried with to ensure that your spirit will have a smooth passage into a good afterlife. So that's one main document that we can see in the surviving fragments. There are other fragments that are pieces of what I would call another spell book for a woman, referred to as Ta Sheret Min. And these incantations are meant to keep her safe from demonic enemies, allow her to be safe in the underworld. In the afterlife, it would allow her to consume food and drink rather than nasty stuff like excrement and urine. So I think scholars have identified a couple of other texts as well. And as a non-Egyptologist, that's about as much as I know. Certainly, like you said, with regard to the date, that there aren't any reasons to presume that these texts contained anything about Abraham and Joseph.
Okay, so to summarize what you write and what other Egyptologists have said, these are probably dead Egyptians of some import who were buried, a couple hundred years before Jesus is born, thousands, possibly thousands of years after Joseph or Abraham would have lived, and the scrolls buried with them are either just common funeral or burial writings that, according to Rittner, are buried with all sorts of different influential Egyptians who were buried within that time period. Very common funeral scrolls, and or some scrolls referring to the history of the people being buried, but certainly the word, the name Abraham or the name Joseph or any of the history that would corroborate with the Old Testament is not a word anywhere in any of the scrolls or fragments. Correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And but then Joseph declares them as being what? What does he say the scrolls are, and who wrote them, and when were they written according to Joseph?
So, I think this is from a letter of Oliver Cowdery from later in 1835 that I have to check the note. He identified them as the sacred record kept of Joseph in Pharaoh's court in Egypt and the teachings of Father Abraham. Now, I suppose if you wanted to talk about the dating, the wouldn't necessarily have to be the text written by their hands. It could have been, rewritten like texts are, but essentially these are not documents about biblical characters. They're not documents about Joseph or Abraham. They are pretty typical, as far as I know, Egyptian funerary mortuary texts.
I mean, it's almost, I don't want to say endearing, but it's like, the way I'm envisioning it is in Joseph's mind, when he thinks Egypt, he thinks Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And he thinks, well, he would have thought Moses, he would have thought Joseph, and he would have thought Abraham. He sees two scrolls, and he's like, one of the scrolls must be Abraham, and one of the scrolls must be Joseph.
Yeah, no, I agree.
What an amazing coincidence in Joseph's mind that must have been. That of all the possible mummies and of all the possible scrolls that could arrive in Kirtland, Ohio, it just happens to be the ones that were handwritten by Abraham and Joseph 4 or 5 millennia previously. They just happened to show up in Kirtland.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
this is fun, right?
It's almost endearing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, there would be no reason. It would be much less compelling, in a way, to have additional writings of Moses, because Joseph, like most Christians at the time, believe that, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So we've got writings from him.
Oh yeah, it's like you can't do Moses. Moses has already been done.
Right. I mean, there'd always be room for more Moses. But you can't do better than Abraham, and Joseph. So yeah, I mean, it's fanciful, but there's an element here that, yeah, this is crazy fun, in the sense of we've got these mummies and scrolls roll into town, and I can identify them, I can translate them, I can recover these ancient texts which represent knowledge and spiritual power. I can get started right away. And yeah, like I've been saying, then Joseph takes all sorts of detours, really, 7 years worth, before he publishes the Book of Abraham.
Really quickly, talk about the provenance, I guess, the Chicago Museum and the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. And a lot of apologists will want to say now, well, we only have fragments, like the actual writings of Abraham and Joseph got lost or burned in Chicago. Do you want to just address that really quickly? Sure. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say all I know, and which is not extensive. So at the time of Joseph's death, the mummies and papyri were in the possession of his widow, Emma. She sold them, I think, 10 years later. Then there's a series of transactions. Some of the materials ended up in the Chicago Museum and were destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Other bits eventually ended up in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and were acquired by the LDS Church in 1967. Now, in terms of whether the now lost portions of these scrolls could have contained other texts that were the writings of Abraham and Joseph, there's simply no reason on a scholarly basis to presume that that is the case. I think what we have gives us a pretty representative sense of what these texts were, and essentially they're nothing at all like Joseph Smith identified.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we can look at what exists, and there are mortuary texts. We have a lot of fragments, and there's just no reason to think that these mummies from maybe the 2nd or 3rd century BC, there's no reason to think they would have been holding the writings of Abraham and Joseph. I think we have to, the best scholarly practice is to go on the basis of what we have, which,
yeah, let me say, it makes no sense that these random prominent Egyptians buried somewhere around 200 BC would have just coincidentally had the writings of Abraham and Joseph buried with them.
right. It's not as if the texts that we do have, the fragments that we do have,
in any way,
which are fairly extensive,
Yeah.
right? It's not
Yeah.
as it's not as if they relate in any way to Book of Genesis material. Now, the other, and I am not deeply enmeshed in the apologetics or the responses to the apologetics to the Book of Abraham. For me, the part that's interesting really is, what does this tell us about Joseph Smith?
Right.
But I know that scholars have traced the characters that we do have to Joseph's explication of them. So some of the early manuscripts of the Book of Abraham from 1835, as well as Joseph's Egyptian alphabet and grammar, those include characters from the fragments that we have. And
Right.
Joseph's explanation of them, or his translations of them, they don't match their meaning according to Egyptologists.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was going to say,
we basically know that Joseph was working with the fragments that we have.
Yeah, didn't he publish some versions of the of the hieroglyphics or of the facsimiles in newspapers at the time that also correspond with the fragments that remain?
So one thing that he does publish is he publishes a facsimile of what's called a hypocephalus, which just means under the head. So it's a circular piece of papyrus that would be laid under the mummy's head. And so Joseph in the church in 1842 published a facsimile of that hypocephalus with Joseph's interpretation of it. And Egyptologists can tell you Joseph's interpretation is not accurate.
And that also matches the fragments that we have today, correct?
So on that one, I think we don't have the fragment, but I'm going to check while we're chatting about it.
I mean, there's the images I've seen of like where there are missing parts of the facsimile, them being drawn in by hand and even drawn in wrong.
Right. So we don't have that hypocephalus, I think, but we do have a vignette that is in the Book of Breathing for Horrors. So, and then we have I think we have Joseph's interpretation of that.
So whatever remnants we have of Joseph's workings with and or publication of these scrolls seem to correspond heavily with the fragments that we have in our possession today, correct?
That's a great summary. Absolutely.
Okay, cool. So in terms now of like what Joseph produces, like it's fascinating that it seems like, and you could talk to us about what he ends up producing. It seems like he's trying to synthesize the pictures and the images and even the hieroglyphics that he's reading and that he's seeing with these concepts of, Ham and Egypt and the stars. He's trying to do some sort of synthesis, or we've talked about the word bricolage.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about his production of text from these papyri in the Kirtland time period, at least?
Okay, so the first thing is Joseph begins dictating a text, and it starts. By the way, William Phelps. A few people take dictation from Joseph in between July and November of 1835, including William Phelps. Also, I think Oliver Cowdery and Warren Parrish is the third. So Phelps, I think this is interesting. Phelps labels this the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus and found in the catacombs of Egypt. So it sort of sounds like, we have the exact writing of Abraham, which is quite fascinating.
Like he used ink?
Right,
He had a pen
right.
and a scroll and Abraham's writing stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do we know for sure that Joseph believed that? Not necessarily, but it sounds like that. So the text starts with Abraham's desire to become a high priest, holding the right belonging to the fathers from the beginning of time, stretching back to Adam. And when Phelps takes this dictation, he copies some characters from one of the papyri, to the left of this text. If listeners are super interested in looking at these themselves, they can pull up these manuscripts on the Joseph Smith Papers website. You can look them in rich detail. They have great high quality images. What's interesting to me is Joseph, he dictates a few sentences and then he stops. And then Joseph and I think at the time it's just Phelps and Cowdery, they start working on an alphabet that would help them understand what they're calling the Book of Abraham. And they're working on a grammar of the Egyptian language. And so they spend a lot of time looking at these hieroglyphs and pictures. They make some copies of them. They sketch out a possible alphabet. They start working on a grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. And yeah, this is pretty, on the one hand, this is just pretty rough work, or fanciful work, even. They take characters from the papyri, but they also take characters from elsewhere. They may have taken some from the pure language samples. Some of them they may have just kind of filled in, maybe on the basis of revelation, because these are decaying scrolls. Some bits are missing. So it's a kind of a mishmash of characters, mishmash of language and ideas. And then Joseph starts unfolding what you could call, I would call, mini stories out of these glyphs. And he has this idea, which is not original to him, that a single Egyptian character can contain a pretty expansive meaning. So that
In other words, multiple sentences from one character, correct?
Exactly.
That was a misunderstanding of Egyptian hieroglyphics.
Exactly, as far as I know. And that each character also has degrees of meaning, from starting with a pretty short first degree to, almost sometimes a long sentence, fifth degree. So, for instance, he identified one character, this is maybe not surprising, as Abraham. And in the fifth degree, he renders that as a father of many nations, a prince of peace, one who keeps the commandments of God, a patriarch, a rightful heir, a high priest.
And I mean, I think it's fair to say that's not how Egyptian hieroglyphics work, that they have multiple levels of meaning, superficial meanings, and then more in-depth meanings. that can even mean full sentences. Egyptologists would say that's not how
Correct.
Egyptian works. Yeah.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that was how Joseph's mind was working.
Yeah.
And and some of these are fascinating. He's got there's this striking image of a woman paddling a boat. It's a little character, and Joseph transliterates it as iota to as zip z, and then its first degree meaning is the land of Egypt first seen underwater. But then there's really a mini story in its fifth degree meaning, which he renders as the land of Egypt, which was first discovered by a woman while underwater and afterwards settled by her sons, she being a daughter of Ham. And we learn that she has brought the record of the fathers and the art of embalming with her to Egypt.
Like, I wrote to ask you, what is he doing? Why is he creating a grammar and alphabet? And then why is he going off script from his understanding of the Bible and simply doing either let's just say sincere Bible fan fiction and just talking about Abraham and his journey and his Isaac and Sarah or whoever? He's like going off script and also trying to almost write Egyptian history tied to the mummies and characters. Like, which is it? Is it Old Testament biblical stuff, or is it Egyptian history of real life characters? Like, what's he doing with the Gale, you know?
Yeah, no, Joseph's mind is always going in a lot of directions, John. It's just hard for us to keep up. So I do think for Joseph, he does have this standing interest in the stories of Cain and Canaan in the book of Genesis. So this at least intersects with that. In a way, it's still Bible fan fiction, if you will. So this daughter of Ham going to Egypt, I mean, it is in a way, it's a totally digressive point, but it intersects with this idea of priesthood and lineage and curses that we know that Joseph was interested in during his translation of the Bible. In a way, it connects to some of the material in the Book of Mormon as well.
I may have mentioned this on a podcast with you before, but I've certainly said it in other Mormon Stories episodes. It's occurred to me that Joseph Smith could not produce scripture without including some sort of cursings of dark skin based on wickedness. And so whether that's the Lamanites' dark skin based on their wickedness, or the curse of Cain, which I think appears in Doctrine and Covenants, Book of Moses, and Book of Abraham, this is the example of Joseph needing to insert some sort of dark-skinned based wickedness curse into his canonized scripture. And I don't know if you'll find this interesting or even novel. I was taught growing up that Egyptians were black, and I was taught this in Mormon seminary class. And I guess the line of thinking is, well, if Cain was cursed with dark skin for killing Abel, and then he becomes the father of the African race, we know that, during the time of Noah, everyone died on earth. So how did Cain's curse survive Noah's flood? Well, it must have been that somehow one of the children of Noah or the in-laws of Noah were cursed with dark skin or carried the curse with them. And then I was taught that, I guess, Noah's son Ham married a woman named Egyptus, who was Egyptian, and she must have been black. And that's how the curse of Cain made it through the flood and then made it through society. Is all that's probably stuff you know very well, but this is all stuff I was taught in high school as a Mormon seminary student. And it probably isn't even uniquely Mormon,
well,
these teachings.
No, but I mean, in the broad strokes, no. I mean, for centuries, um, Jews, Christians, and Muslims identified the descendants of Canaan, the son of Ham, with dark-skinned African peoples. So that was common. Joseph is unusual in, I would say, forging some direct connections between Cain and Canaan through this, you know, daughter, through this figure. So I lay this out in the chapter. It's a little bit arcane, but you can make connections through Joseph's early 1830s translation of the scriptures, specifically the book of Genesis. And then he's sort of returning to this idea with the Egyptian materials and the book of Abraham. And, I'll just take the opportunity to say, it's tragic that these ideas then just filtered down through the church, because in a way, Joseph had this passing, well, not passing interest. He did have this recurrent interest in curses and dark skin. But I would say that for Joseph, um, race and slavery and curses, in a way, I would say they were episodic interests rather than central concerns. And I think his views on race were actually a bit unsettled. But he left behind these texts about cursed people that I think, in a way, were a curse for the tradition
Of Mormonism?
Mm-hmm.
And are you referring to like the legacy of
Correct.
doctrinal racism
Right.
and even procedural or administrative racism in the church?
Absolutely, because I'm saying it in a way it's a little bit tragic, because Joseph himself in 1836, a year after dictating some of what we've just talked about, Joseph didn't object to the ordination of a black church member,
Elijah Abel, right?
Elijah Abel,
Yeah.
into the priesthood. So Joseph, on the one hand, he left behind these texts about um, divine curses and skin color in the Book of Mormon, in his translation of the scriptures. The Book of Abraham, I think, doesn't directly discuss skin color, but it does refer to this cursed lineage. And so on the one hand, you have Joseph's, practices in his own life and leadership of the church, which I do think on race they're a bit of a mixed bag. But then you have these texts, and so he leaves behind this scriptural legacy, which is very difficult for his successors to detangle.
And didn't you write that in 1836, Joseph opposed the abolition of slavery in part based on these writings of his interpretation of the Book of Abraham? Did I get that right?
So he makes a comment in 1836 in which he cites the curse of Canaan as a reason why he's opposed to abolition. And he says the curse is not yet taken off the sons of Canaan. That's pretty standard fare for white American Christians in the 1830s, most of whom are staunchly opposed to abolitionism. I think what's interesting for Joseph, what is more distinctive in terms of Joseph's work, is his creation of these texts.
Yeah, he canonizes the racism.
Correct.
Which the Bible, which I had to, my non-LDS Christian friends had to remind me, the Bible doesn't actually say Cain was given black skin for murdering Abel. It just says a mark was put upon him.
Right.
It's Joseph Smith that actually makes it about skin color and wickedness.
Well, and I think the way you put it a minute ago is correct. He, in a way, he canonizes those ideas because a lot of white Christians believe them, but Joseph specifies in his translation of the book of Genesis that the seed of Cain were black. And this isn't maybe quite as crystal clear that a veil of darkness shall cover Canaan. And then I think you see Joseph connecting those sort of joint Cain and Canaan curses. And then you have this woman who discovers Egypt, who comes from the loins of Ham. I think it's suggested she's a descendant of Cain through her mother. So, in a way, Joseph's bringing together these kind of commonplace ideas about race and curses, but he writes them in to what become the scriptures of the tradition. And I think that's a bit of a curse.
Yeah, if y'all check out Matt Harris's book, Second Class Saints, along with our 17-part series, it certainly has been a curse to the church in many ways. But it wasn't Joseph Smith that implemented the priesthood ban on black people and the temple ban on black people. It was Brigham Young. But clearly, Brigham Young based much of his eventual priesthood and temple ban on what he learned from Joseph Smith and from the scriptures that Joseph Smith produced. So, really quickly, we talked about whether or not Moses or Abraham existed. Just to sanity check, there's even less evidence to suggest that one, Adam and Eve existed, two, that Noah existed, and certainly three, that African people come from a woman named Egyptus and a man named Ham, who emerged from a global flood around 4,000 years before the birth of Jesus. Is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, I have to say, John, I'm a U.S. historian. My PhD is basically U.S. history. So,
Okay.
but
So maybe.
But I'm just going to say, as a Christian, I don't know if this will strike you or others as a little bit weird or not. I'm well aware of the scholarly consensus on things like the flood or Adam and Eve or Abraham or Moses, and so if pressed, I'm always happy to say the scholarly consensus is there's at least no extra biblical corroboration for them. For me, as a Christian, they're still very much real characters or real people, whether or not they're historical figures. Or I guess when I think about biblical narratives, I'm a little bit more of a maximalist, only in the sense of I sort of, at least mentally or spiritually, sort of presuppose their historicity in a way that just sort of works for me personally, even if the scholarship isn't there to back it up.
Right. But I mean, you would agree that people have been living on the African continent as black people
Yes.
existed on the African continent tens or even hundreds of thousands of years prior to the dating of a potential Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago.
Absolutely.
Which then means, you have to just become flexible, non-literal, if you're going to say there is some historical basis to Noah and Adam and Eve, then you just have to become a little more flexible about the timeline and or what is meant by these figures, correct?
Yeah, no, I think so. And this is slightly off topic, but if you're going to think about the historicity of Moses and the Exodus, the book of Exodus describes a really big exodus. I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people. And that seems unlikely. But at the same time, we do have some extra biblical corroboration for the Egyptians taking peoples captive and enslaving them. And could an ancient Israelite have led a captive people out of slavery? I mean, that's not, that
Yeah.
is less far-fetched, right? That could have happened.
Okay. All right. So, and then the other thing is there a difference between Cain, Cain, the son of Adam and Eve, and Canaan, the land, Can, what, Aan? And are those synonymous? I've never really understood whether we should think of Canaan meaning the land of Cain, the son of Adam and Eve.
Okay, great question. So it is confusing because there's Cain, and then there's a person Cain, and a person Canaan, and a land Canaan.
Right.
So for starters, there's Cain, the curse of Cain, which is relating to Cain's murder of Abel. And then there's the curse, it's usually called the curse of Ham, but it's actually a curse that's placed on Canaan, who is a son of Ham. So there's Cain and Canaan, two different biblical characters, and then the land of Canaan. And I don't know. I'm now exceeding my my knowledge. I assume it's connected. Since it's the same name, those two must be connected. But I'm going to struggle to tell you how.
Last question outside your expertise. Do we know whether Egyptians 4,000 to 5,000 years ago would be what we would commonly refer to as Africans in today's parlance? Would they be more Semitic, looking, European looking? Do we know the ethnic? I don't know if racial is even a thing, but like the skin color of alleged Egyptians 4,000 to 6,000 years ago?
That's a great question. Well, again, that's just not my field of expertise at all. I will presume that they looked more like contemporary people in North Africa,
right?
Which probably have slightly darker skin than you and I, but not as dark as sub-Saharan Africans.
They would be the ancestors of what we would think of as Middle Easterners or Arabs today.
Correct.
With kind of brown skin versus the ancestors of sub-Saharan Africans, which would be those with more black skin.
And there's some great scholarship on the history of these curses as Jews, Christians, and Muslims understood them.
Yeah.
And it's really when traders begin bringing dark-skinned Africans to the Mediterranean world that Jews, Christians, and Muslims connect these curses to dark skin, which, as you said, that is not in the biblical texts themselves.
Perfect. Okay, back to your book. So what's this astronomy cosmology thing Joseph's doing? He's talking about planets. He's going like Neil deGrasse Tyson on us here in the Book of Abraham. He even comes up with this 1,000 years of human time is a day in God. He comes up with Kolob. Why in the world would Joseph go Neil deGrasse Tyson in the Book of Abraham? And are there any potential contemporary sources that could possibly be inspiring Joseph's Neil deGrasse Tyson riff of his potential Bible fan fiction?
So that's great. So I mentioned that Joseph took, after some initial efforts on translation and grammar and alphabet, he takes a break for, I think, a couple of months. And then in October, as you said, he unfolds this system of astrology. That's the way Oliver Cowdery describes it.
Not astronomy, astrology, huh?
Sorry, astronomy. Sorry,
okay.
Astronomy.
No, I wasn't sure.
No, astronomy.
Okay.
And what Joseph does is, with Cowdery and Phelps, he identifies characters from the papyri as representing stars and planets. And then he sketches out sort of this vision of the cosmos. It consists of what he calls 15 moving planets, 15 fixed stars, and then millions of other planets, all revolving around God, this which he describes as the source of all light. And one of those fixed stars, like you said, he names Kolob, which he says signifies the first creation nearer to the celestial, or the residence of the Lord.
So he's putting God Almighty on a planet, correct?
That is correct. He says it's the residence of the Lord.
So that's interesting because, I mean, we've talked about Joseph's conceptions of the Trinity and how that affects, how that shows up in the Book of Mormon text, but then also in the 1832 version of the first vision. We haven't gotten to the 1838 version yet. Does this potentially represent an evolution of his sense of a corporeal, temporal deity, if he's now, instead of having God be a spirit who's in the heavens, is he giving God a body when he puts him on a physical planet called Kolob?
Yeah.
I don't mean to be making too much of this, but
no. Well, it's fascinating. I don't know if we can quite say corporeal. I mean, having a residence might imply that.
Yeah, because a spirit wouldn't need a home, you know?
But I think he doesn't, if you will, pun intended, he doesn't flesh out what that means at this point.
Nice.
I mean, I do think already in 1833, he's thinking about, some fundamental similarity among God, Jesus Christ, and men. But this is a pretty wild idea, to have a specific planetary residence of the Lord. You had asked, can you find sort of cultural antecedents or influences for this? One could be, there's a Scottish philosopher, Thomas Dick. I think Ben Park wrote an essay exploring the connections between Joseph's thought and that of Thomas Dick. You can find ideas about fixed stars, innumerable worlds, systems around an ultimate center. I think you can find precedents for that in Dick and some other contemporary thinkers.
You also mentioned Josephus, right?
Well, that is for the more general idea that Abraham had brought the sciences of mathematics and astronomy to the Egyptians. So in a way, what Joseph is doing here is recovering some of that ancient lost knowledge. I will say that, as I've said before, you can find precedents, you can find influences, you can find things in the culture. Joseph's a pretty creative thinker, though, in the sense of he doesn't just latch on to somebody else's ideas and run with them. So in Thomas Dick, you might find some of these things like fixed stars and this almost infinite number of planets, right? Which I think when you number them in the millions, you're basically, it's almost to infinity. But these other thinkers are not postulating a residence of the Lord. So, Joseph always gives anything else he grabs hold of, he gives it his own twist.
Yeah. Okay, so when people want to say that, like, the Book of Abraham borrows from the Mound Builder myth or View of the Hebrews,
You mean the Book of Mormon?
What's that?
You mean the Book of Mormon?
What did I say?
Abraham?
Yeah, people want to say the Book of Mormon borrows from the Mound Builder myth or the View of the Hebrews. as inspiration, is it fair to say that it's reasonable to look to the writings of Thomas Dick and or Josephus as potential inspiration for what Joseph ends up writing in the Book of Abraham, at least partially?
So this is the way I would think about it. There are some excerpts from Thomas Dick in the Church's own Messenger and Advocate. I forget which years. So whether or not it predates or postdates this, I'm not sure. Can't remember. Joseph, as just a semi-educated person, may have had some familiarity with Josephus, probably not intimate. But what I would say again is, I think Joseph's detractors and critics, and I would say even contemporary detractors and critics, if you find possible influences or precedents, it takes away from the idea that Joseph's texts are just bolts out of the blue in terms of revelation. And I think that's fair. At the same time, if we lean too much into the idea that this source or this thinker or that thinker explains what Joseph is doing, we run the risk of missing his creative engagement with these ideas, because Joseph doesn't just take ideas out of View of the Hebrews. He doesn't just take ideas from Thomas Dick. I think he encounters these ideas in his culture. To put it in really colloquial terms, they bounce around in his brain, and he produces, I think, what are original and creative efforts that go off in new directions.
Is the word midrash appropriate here?
I mean, I think that could be appropriate for the more general way, especially that Joseph works with biblical material and adds his own stories and traditions. I think especially sort of that narrative expansion of biblical material does strike me as midrashic. But
Okay.
midrash is great. Like, it's not an insult to describe something as midrash, right?
No, that's like the foundations of Judaism, right?
Right.
Many of the foundations of Judaism.
So, yeah. So it actually sounds a little bit more respectful than to call it fan fiction, though I sometimes use that term as well.
And then how do you think, like, again, let's just assume he sincerely believed he was channeling revelation or translating ancient records. Like, there's a lot of things that his mind could have determined were being written by the hand of Abraham. He goes, astronomical. He goes into planets and solar systems and God on his throne in a planet called Kolob. How would that have been? Why would he have prioritized that, even subconsciously? And how would that have been received by his readers or his believers? It's like, whoa, we've got some new scripture here. What did Joseph write? What did Abraham write about? Yeah. And it's like, oh, billions of planets in a solar system and God on a throne called Kolob. Do you think people would have been captivated by this at the time, inspired?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, I do think some church members, they are inspired when Joseph finally publishes this in 1842. So I would say yes. I mean, I think that was possible. In terms of these millions of planets and infinite worlds, Joseph has that idea at the beginning of what becomes the Book of Moses. So that idea he's already put into circulation. I do think there is pretty widespread Christian interest in lineages and curses. So that material, which is in the first chapter of the Book of Abraham as well, I could see interest in that. And to be fair, I don't think it's historical, and I certainly don't think it's biblical. But Joseph's expansion of or sort of interjection into the book of Genesis, in which you have an Abraham who's upset about his father's abandonment of the one true God and of priesthood, and the story about him being the next sacrificial victim of a priest of Pharaoh. And he cries out to the Lord, who appears to him in a vision and then smites the wicked priests. It's not a bad opening, as far as that goes. The Book of Mormon opens with a bit of violence too, really, in First Nephi. So it's not.
It's a role Charlton Heston could play in a Hollywood epic, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe get Chris Hemsworth or something to play Abraham now. I don't know. I'm not sure. So I see. Joseph. He's got the beginning of a story, but at the same time, it is curious to me, and I can't fully explain it, why he doesn't just push on in 1835. And in a way, you think of what Joseph accomplished with the Book of Mormon, right? In 1829, he dictates the entirety of what we have in a couple months. And now he's been working on this Egyptian material for 5 months. And it's something that, in theory, you could write it in a day. And in a sense, that's more typical of Joseph after the Book of Mormon. He works on the translation of the scriptures, but never really finishes it. And now he's working on this in fits and starts. I have this line in the book I like, John, if I can praise my own writing.
Please.
Where I write, the Mormon prophet remained an author whose first novel proved a niche hit, but who could never finish the second book.
Yeah,
So, there's no sequel. And I do think on some level, Joseph has wanted to prove his critics wrong. He's wanted to show he's really a translator, whether that's on the basis of revelation, whether that's on the basis of something more scholarly. And I think he's frustrated with the fact that he just, he can play around with these ideas, but he certainly can't master the hieroglyphics. And so he switches gears by November from Egyptian to Hebrew. And I think he believes that learning Hebrew is going to help him in his attempt to decipher the papyri, and that both Hebrew and Egypt, they will get him closer to that language of God that he's been interested in.
Okay, I have a couple questions I want to follow up on, and I don't want to forget either. But the first one is, like, just for the part of the Book of Abraham that we're covering from the Kirtland time period, do you have a sense for how Christians, Protestants then or now would they look at it as blasphemous, as silly, as interesting, as inspirational? Like, the stuff he does produce, how do you think Joseph Campbell would have or did interpret these claimed additions to the sacred story of Abraham? You know what I'm saying? Or do we even know?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I've never looked into it because Joseph published it in the church's Nauvoo newspaper. I'm sure there were some contemporary responses to the Book of Abraham. And plenty of people came to both Kirtland and Nauvoo and looked at the mummies and the papyri. I find it actually rather charming that even in 1844, I think it's either Joseph or Lucy Mack Smith, they're charging visitors, 25 or 50 cents to see these artifacts, which is, I don't know, I kind of find that a little bit charming.
You think they made their money back on their investment? It's hard to imagine.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
No,
At 50
definitely
cents a
not.
visit.
No. They don't get there. But yeah, if they responded to it, I would think most Protestant Christians would find this either just nonsensical or blasphemous, in the sense of Christianity, at least, especially in its Protestant forms, just hasn't really liked the idea of fan fiction. I mean, not in any way that suggests that it's scriptural.
No, I think when certain evangelical Christians call Mormons demonic or satanic, part of what gets them mad is any change to the Bible whatsoever, right?
Absolutely.
I just
And
think that's evil to add a word or a letter to the Bible.
right. And this is starting to touch on some things that really rankle evangelicals. The idea that God is corporeal, or would have a residence, or would be confined in a way to a physical location, that bumps up against theological beliefs that many other Christians hold very fervently. So there's some real theological clash on these points too.
Okay. And then, yeah, you're reminding us that whatever he did in 1835 or 1836 doesn't show up until 5 or 6 or 7 years later. So this is all work being done behind the scenes, but never really published about in the Kirtland time period.
Right.
Or Missouri time period.
Right. Joseph is sort of, I would say he's sort of teasing it. And I don't mean that pejoratively. He's teasing it during these months. So when missionaries return to Kirtland, he'll show them the mummies and the papyri, and tell them that he's translating it. He'll show it to other visitors, and he tells some people that it's the same language as the Book of Mormon, and that he can read it. But at the end of the day, there's not a lot to show for his efforts as of 1835, and he ends up shelving the project and, like I said, transferring his attention to Hebrew instead.
Okay. And then this is just a thought that I had as we've talked about, like possibly the Joseph's first vision account, which changes between 1832 and 1838, seems to change according to his evolving theology about God and Jesus and the Trinity. I wonder if we could say that what he ends up writing about the Book of Abraham in 1835, or what he produces from his quote translation of the papyri in 1835 versus what he ends up producing in the Nauvoo time period, does what he produce in the later versions also correspond with his evolving theology, like it did with his verse vision story and or his edits to the Book of Mormon, right?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is not so much an evolving theology, but an evolving, well, it probably is a developing theology, but also evolving interest. So the later portions of the Book of Abraham that relate to this story of creation and Jesus and Satan volunteering to go and create a world and people choosing to follow one or the other. None of that, as far as I know, is in the 1835 material.
That's Nauvoo stuff.
That's all, as far as I know, that's all Nauvoo.
We Mormons call that the war in heaven, where Jesus
Correct.
and Satan
Right.
produce conflicting plans, and there are all these intelligences or spirits, which is us, who have to choose. All that comes through Nauvoo time period, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And do those things reflect what he's thinking about in Nauvoo at the time?
I think that's fair. I'm trying to think in my own mind. I'm sure Joseph had given the idea of a war in heaven some thought beforehand, because that's also not an idea that's completely original to Joseph. We can get more into that when we get ourselves to 1842. But yeah, I mean, and Joseph dictates the remaining text, I think, in a relatively short period of time in 1842, and it reflects what he's interested in and thinking about at that moment.
Yeah, which is interesting. If the text had been written 3 or 6,000 years prior to it being received in Kirtland, why is what he's producing reflecting what his interests are between 1835 and 1842? But also, I'm just thinking about it. If what he ends up writing is that Jesus is presenting a plan to God, that really does indicate God and Jesus are very separate beings at that point. Because why would God be presenting a plan to himself through Jesus? It must suggest that Jesus is a totally separate being than God if he's trying to persuade God to make a certain choice relative to Satan. And this again touches on the evangelical claims that Mormons are satanic or Luciferian or whatever, because they're really mad that Joseph would suggest that Jesus and Satan are brothers, which would imply that Jesus is a literal son of God, along with Lucifer or Satan and the rest of us. So again, this is all blowing my mind to actually try and think about it more deeply, which is what your book helps us do, which I really appreciate.
Yeah. I mean, what I see in 1835, I see a Joseph who you would think maybe he doesn't care what his critics say, right? I mean, he knows people regard him as this ignorant, uneducated fraud. I think he does want to, in some way, respond to that criticism with the Abraham Project. And he wants also to get more education and learning. Like I say at one point in the book, he knows he's a rough stone, but he'd like to be a little smoother. And
That's good.
so he's working on this project. He doesn't, for whatever reason, he doesn't bring it to fruition in 1835. And he takes this detour into Hebrew. And I think I sense, he was frustrated with his inability to decipher the Egyptian characters. I think at the start, it was fun. It was fun to buy mummies. It was fun to look at these papyri. It was fun to make this grammar and alphabet. I think we forget that Joseph, he is a mirthful guy. I think he and his associates, they loved this project at the start. Phelps and Cowdery, I think, are really bummed when he shelves it for a couple months at one stretch. But I think in the end, this is a frustrating effort for Joseph. He's unable to accomplish what he wants with the project in 1835, and that's why he sets it aside, and he finds somebody who can teach him an ancient language that he actually can learn to some extent.
So I'll just conclude with, I'll call it in jest, the $2,400 question. Why do you suppose Joseph didn't feel confident producing another 300 plus pages of a sequel? What was holding Joseph back? Like, again, the catalyst theory, which is what modern Mormon apologists use to explain away the, inaccurate translation that Egyptologists would claim Joseph produced. They say it was just channeling revelation, with the scrolls being just inspiration, not a translation. If Joseph were unbridled by actually having to do an actual translation, and he was free to just use the scrolls as a catalyst to channel pure revelation, then why would you guess Joseph didn't just do that in 1835, produce the sequel to the Book of Mormon, a 350-page tome that he could sell for $30 a copy and provide a bunch of more light and wisdom to the world. What was holding Joseph back from writing that sequel?
That's a great question. Well, we don't ultimately know. So here's some possibilities.
If you had to guess.
The Book of Mormon, it serves a clear purpose. Would have been very difficult for Joseph to organize a church and have it grow as successfully as it did without the Book of Mormon. It was sort of the special sauce for his movement at first that distinguished it from other new churches and movements. So if Joseph had dictated a much longer Book of Abraham, there wasn't necessarily a clear purpose for it. I think Joseph, in a way, he has these ideas. He's not really sure what to do with them. He's more sure in 1842 because he integrates them with the ordinance that becomes known as the endowment. So in a way, he shelves it until he's got something to do with it. I think, secondly, when I'm sort of joking about him never finishing the second book, Joseph is going in different directions, right? In 1835, we're looking ahead, but we're getting close to the completion of the Kirtland Temple and its dedication. By the end of 1835, Joseph has this foray into Hebrew, but his main attention is getting the church and its elders ready for the temple's dedication and the solemn assembly that he's been pointing forward to for quite some time. So he's at first transfixed by the scrolls and the papyri, loves playing around with them. I think is a bit frustrated with his attempts, isn't really sure what to do with them, and shelves them until he is.
So here's my theory now that you've helped me think about this more. The difference was, number one, he was way more busy in 1835 and 1836 than he was in 1829, right?
Yeah.
He's literally like living on the Hale farm, not wanting to farm, versus like running multiple cities and trying to lead an emerging church. So he had a lot less time to actually write the book, right?
Yeah.
But then also he didn't have, if we could just assume that he was percolating on the Book of Mormon for the 10 years prior to his writing it, because we know based on his mother's account, Lucy, that he was telling stories about Native Americans for the 10 years leading up to the Book of Mormon. Plus, we knew that he had plans to write the book for at least 7 years prior to its actual publication. He didn't have the lead time to think about, what he might want to write and to develop the stories, along with time to think about what questions and problems he wanted to solve. It's more like a dude shows up with scrolls and mummies, and he's like, well, I'm running all these cities and trying to build this church, and I've got a little bit of time. What can I make of this? That's a very different scenario than I've got 10 years, at least 7, to think about what am I going to put into this book and what are all the problems that I want to solve. It's just a very different setting to be able to produce a sequel.
I think so. And he doesn't seem to have wanted to do that, right? I mean, he could have simply started dictating. He could have dictated a much longer text just in the first month. But he does all of these detours with the characters. I do think in some way he wanted to prove himself as more than just a revelatory translator. I think it's a frustrating effort. And I agree. In addition to him being really busy, he doesn't know what he wants to do with these ideas yet.
I mean, if he didn't have plates in the Book of Mormon translation or actual gold plates with Reformed Egyptian, but he still believed he was producing something through revelation, it could be more imaginative and fluid. But if he's looking at actual real hieroglyphics and he wants to be a genuine translator, he's got to find a way to make sense of that versus whatever he can do through imagination.
Right.
And so that's going to be harder. And it's almost, again, a potential witness to his sincerity. The fact that he, number one, tries to create the grammar and alphabet, and that he ultimately stops. It shows some potential sincerity that he wants to actually, if he's going to translate, he wants to actually translate. And the fact that he stops suggests that maybe he was not feeling like he was able to produce a genuine translation at the time.
I speculate along those lines in the book. I mean, I think the thing, what Joseph doesn't leave us is he doesn't leave us with a diary that explains the choices he's making during these months. He has scribes who keep journals for him during these years, but it's not as if we get an entry from, late November 1835 where Joseph's writing in his journal saying, "I just don't think I can do it. I'm gonna,
Right.
or
God, why won't you help me here? Where are you,
right."
God?
So, we don't know how he's experiencing this. I read the fits and starts as, element of frustration and uncertainty, but we just don't know for sure. We can document with pretty good detail what Joseph is doing in terms of this collection of text during these months, but in terms of the why and what he's making of it, we just don't know as much as we would like to.
And the only other final thing I'll add, what's covered in your book and what we've talked about in previous episodes, is he is experiencing a lot of pesky fact checkers, whether it's E.D. Howe or Hurlbut and others, who are like criticizing him for automatic revelations, who are condemning him for his revelations not coming true. All those pesky fact checkers and accountability police and even anti-Mormons certainly would affect his confidence in like just producing a bunch of stuff that could then be fact checked and possibly disproven, or contradictions could be shown, not to mention whatever scrutiny would have been applied to the Book of Mormon. And you've already talked about the fact that his volume of revelations by this point has precipitously declined by 1835. And so all of those factors would have likely dented his confidence in just automatically producing a bunch of stuff, right?
I think that's possible. I think also, but the other thing I would say, and we will get into this perhaps in the next chapter, is Joseph, if he's looking around himself in Kirtland, he's seeing this under construction temple, which he's got scores of people working on. It's also super expensive, costs a lot more than the mummies in the end. And it is something tangible. It becomes an accomplishment in a way that his critics can't gainsay.
It's real. And also, not to mention all the refugees in Missouri that still are expecting some sort of resolution to the Zion problem. I guess just again, he's got a lot on his plate.
He has a lot on his plate. And at the same time, with all of Joseph's kinetic energy and initiatives, he does have this genuine thirst for learning and self-improvement.
Yeah.
And it's always fits and starts, but there's this detail that when Joseph turns 30 years old in December of 1835, he spends his birthday studying Greek.
Yeah.
On some level, that seems kind of, my goodness, you're just getting started with Hebrew, but he was always rough. He wasn't scholarly like Alexander Campbell or Jonathan Edwards, but he did want to learn and he did want to improve himself.
I think he was genuinely trying to learn how to translate stuff better and better. I'll just say one conclusion I have from this chapter and previous ones. I think it could be argued that the Book of Abraham Project is a testament to Joseph Smith's sincerity versus it's weird because I always thought of a book of Abraham as the clearest evidence of Joseph's fraud. But if you really study the mechanics of it and his fits and starts and pausing and his attempt to create the Gale and to study other languages, maybe it could be argued that the Book of Abraham project could be one of the greatest evidences of Joseph Smith's sincerity.
Well, I don't mind you arguing that. I guess what I would say is, I say at the outset that only rarely do I want to try to measure Joseph Smith's sincerity because that's not an empirical thing that we can easily study. So I do that in terms of the Book of Mormon. The farthest I'm willing to go on the Book of Abraham is that it's not a straightforward act of deception. I don't know if at the start Joseph knew, look, I'm gonna say these are Joseph and Abraham and run with it. But I agree. He's engaged in these materials on a granular basis. Granular if fanciful.
I mean, I want to hear, keep going.
No, I was going to say, and so whether that's sincerity or just complexity, I think we don't know. I do think he wanted to, I guess I would go so far as to say he wanted to figure these Egyptian materials out, and it proved really hard.
Yeah, and I'll just repeat what I said at the beginning, which is if all you're trying to do is get money, power, and sex, I'm sure Joseph was smart enough to figure out a lot of other ways he could spend his time to get money, power, and sex than to try and decipher Egyptian and create a grammar and an alphabet and study Hebrew and all the things that he did in this Book of Abraham project. He could have just produced a bunch of stuff that was manipulative and, coercive, which he didn't do. He's writing about planets and astrology and the universe and Kolob and Cain and Ham. And it's not even manipulative stuff. It's theological.
Yeah, it's theological.
Not like, give me your house, give me your money, give me your daughters, right? It's not that.
It's quixotic also. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, John, you've been very patient. We've gone over the time you gave me. I'm just going to quickly tell everyone in the world to buy this book, Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet. I turned a corner, John Turner. I used to just by default say that the best biography of Joseph Smith will always be Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History. This is starting for me to overtake Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History as the best biography of Joseph Smith for me personally, because I am learning so much, and it's going into so much more detail than Fawn Brody had the luxury of doing, but it's not doing it as a slog. The chapters are very concise and readable and interesting. So that's not me trying to blow sunshine in your direction. I'm really loving this book, and I'm loving the time you're willing to spend with us. And I'm just so very grateful, sincerely.
I'm having a blast. Thanks for the sunshine. I want all the sunshine. I want to convert everybody to that point of view, John Dehlin.
Well, you heard it first here on Mormon Stories, October 2nd, 2025. Thanks, John Turner. So next episode is what?
Kirtland Temple. Yeah.
Okay, Kirtland Temple. All right, John Turner, you're a gentleman and a scholar. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, everybody, for listening.
All right. And thanks, everyone, again, for joining us today on Mormon Stories podcast. Again, I'll just thank all the donors that make Mormon Stories possible. Please subscribe to this channel on YouTube, on Spotify, wherever you consume this content. Please like this episode. Please comment on it. Please share it. If you don't like my takes, if you've got evidence or disagreements with my takes or John's takes or with what we've talked about today, we want to hear it. We want to bring it up in future episodes. So please comment on YouTube. Please email us at mormonstories@gmail.com with your comments or questions, with your disagreements, with your effusive praise, with your condemnatory disagreements. We want to hear it all. Please email us. Please comment. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you if you donate to Mormon Stories or to the Joseph Smith Podcast Project. You could do that at donorbox.org/Joseph Smith if you want to become a donor to this series with John Turner. We really appreciate everyone who's donated. You have made this series possible. I want to thank Julia for all her good work, along with Brooklyn behind the scenes to make all this stuff a reality. Thanks to the board of directors that runs the Open Stories Foundation and that governs the fiduciary responsibilities of this nonprofit. Thanks to all the supporters, viewers, and listeners. We still have another 15 or 16 chapters to go. But we promise it's going to be interesting, and it's going to just get better because we're not even yet to Independence Jail. We're not even yet to Nauvoo. We're not to John C. Bennett, to the polygamy. There's to Carthage. There's so much to Joseph being crowned a king, and the Danites or the Council of 50. Like, there's so much more to come. So we hope you're enjoying this series. We hope you stay tuned for future episodes. We're thankful for all the support. Be good to each other. Be kind to each other. Buy this book. And we'll see you all again soon on another episode of the Joe Smith Podcast and of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care, everybody.